The 11th season of Ninjago is certainly a divisive one amongst the community. A lot of people like it and a lot of people don't, but I'm not dipping my toes into that debate today. But today I want to talk about something that actually came from season 11, and something that, even though it's acknowledged within the community, is something that I don't think people talk about to the full extent. And that, of course, is the Forbidden Scrolls of Spinjitzu, because even though there are a list of powers that people acknowledge when it comes to them, there is certainly a lot more to those scrolls that a lot of people don't realise. And that fact led me down a rabbit hole, and it made me wonder what the true extent of the Forbidden Scrolls of Spinjitzu actually are, and I'm gonna be honest, I truly did not realise how powerful they were. So let me not waste any more of your time, and let's talk about one of the first Spinjitzu Master's more debatable creations in his lifetime, because the Scrolls of Forbidden Spinjitzu is definitely a departure from what we know of him. But what actually is Forbidden Spinjitzu? Well, it is the dark counterpart of Spinjitzu itself, and it was made by the first Spinjitzu Master during the First Age. The first Spinjitzu Master decided to catalogue the knowledge of Forbidden Spinjitzu within two different scrolls, and he sealed this away from his sons as he told them that it's an art that they should not learn. The thing is though, is that it's currently unknown as to why the first Spinjitzu Master actually created Forbidden Spinjitzu, because typically speaking, he dabbles in the powers of creation, and this is certainly a departure from what he was creating, because obviously he has access to destruction, but the fact is that he never distilled those properties into a weapon or an artifact, but in this instance, he did. The best theory as to why he could have created Forbidden Spinjitzu is the fact that he may have potentially made it as a necessary evil. Of course, we know he also created the Realm Crystal, which he only used when absolutely necessary as well, so it is potentially the case that he created it in the event of a situation where his regular abilities would not have been enough. So it was a necessary evil he could have used in that dire event. But the fact is that he hid those scrolls away and he didn't want anyone to use it, in particular his sons. But the fact is that later on, these scrolls were found and ultimately were utilised by different people. Once a user actually held the Forbidden Scrolls of Spinjitzu, they were granted certain abilities. The main one being is that their powers were overcharged. The scrolls themselves actually gave its user incredible levels of power. It increased their elemental ability, it increased the ability of the Spinjitzu Tornado, it extends all of their powers into a very high capacity. And even though the most notable thing is of course the fact that it increases the Spinjitzu Tornado, and that is how we mostly see it, the fact is that it definitively also does increase the elemental power of the user. We mainly see this in Lloyd and in Zane. Of course, Lloyd, the main instance we see that in, is the fact that in the museum when he's holding the scroll, he sends an energy blast into a wall and he causes a hole that usually would not have been the case with his powers. And Lloyd does notarize the fact that his elemental power is notably stronger in this variant, and I do think it's interesting to note that this Forbidden Spinjitzu ability does also increase elemental ability. And of course, like I said, the other one was Zane, who of course uses his ice power and he single-handedly defeats Asphira and her entire army just with the scroll alone. And the fact is that that's not the only instance where he actually does it. The thing is that in the Nether Realm, we actually see Zane, of course, utilize his ice powers, and at the end of the ice chapter, you can definitively see how he actually has got an increased elemental ability. When he is holding the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu and he's attempting to freeze someone in place, when he does it to Lloyd, his ice power immediately happens, and it also does it in a very solid effect. It is a very quick, very concise, and very powerful instance of ice. However, when Zane is not holding the Forbidden Scroll, you will note that when he tries to freeze Vex, it is much slower and his ice is notably a lot weaker looking. So the fact is that his ice power was clearly boosted by the Forbidden Scroll. But those two abilities are the more notable ones when it comes to the scroll, and you will note that there are other instances of the abilities of the scrolls that don't really get mentioned too specifically. The first of its abilities that I don't really see many people talk about is the fact that when you're holding these scrolls of Forbidden Spinjitzu, an elemental master's power is allowed to create more than what it typically does. Of course, take Zane. When Zane is holding the Forbidden Scroll, you will note that the elemental power of ice had the capability of creating living creatures and living people. Of course, Zane created Boreal, the ice dragon who was composed completely of ice. And also the Blizzard army, a lot of people came to believe that it was actually just a corrupted variant of the soldiers, but you will note that they are also made of pure ice. And Lloyd points out that fact when they invade the village. And I do think it's interesting to note that elemental power can create living beings when it's powered up to that extent. And it brings up the argument of, were other objects that increase elemental power also capable of having that effect? The main idea that comes to mind for me is actually the Dragon Cores. It of course increases the elemental ability of the user. So in this case, when Lloyd connects to the Dragon Cores in Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, could he have created elemental creatures out of energy? And this is the ultimate question to me. If an elemental master has enough elemental power coursing through them, could they potentially also create living creatures outside of the use of the scrolls? Honestly, it's an interesting one to think about. I certainly think the Dragon Cores could have let Lloyd do it, but of course we never get to see it. But I do think other elemental power could have done that if it has enough energy. But like I said, that is one of the unspoken abilities. It kind of goes unnoticed even though it does get acknowledged within the show itself. The fact is that it also does charge up the elemental power enough to create these creatures, and I do think it's an interesting implication, because ultimately all of the elemental masters who held it could have done this. It's just the fact that Zane was the one to do it. The second ability that kind of goes unnoticed is the fact that, of course, when we see Asphira using the scroll specifically, we always assume that her magic specifically was the reason for the non-fire elemental abilities. But the fact is that canonically speaking, the scrolls also do have an ability of realm hopping. Or more specifically, banishment. It seems to be that the scrolls are specifically designed to also be able to banish a user, which I do think is an interesting aspect. Personally speaking, I thought for the longest time it was simply Asphira who was doing it, but the fact is that when the ninja then go to the Netherrealm afterwards, of course Pixel does the exact same thing, which implies the fact that of course it's not actually Asphira who's doing it. So it seems to be that when the scrolls are actually active and within the hand of someone, it seems to be able to banish someone to a different realm, or more specifically as well, a different time, because we know for a fact that Zane was also sent back in time when Asphira did it. And I do think it's interesting to note that the scrolls specifically do have that ability. I do think it's strange to note that that is something that Forbidden Spinjitzu can actually do. But let's ponder it. In similar vein to my theory as to why it was created to begin with, being of course the first Spinjitzu master was worried about an enemy that he simply couldn't defeat, my assumption is that when he was creating Forbidden Spinjitzu, he also had an additional ability to call on the energy of the person. And that energy of the person clearly must channel into the ability to create a essentially small realm hop, and I do think it's interesting to note that that is the case. My only belief is that when he's faced with that foe he cannot defeat, he wanted essentially a failsafe. It must take a deal of energy though, because that is certainly an interesting ability for something that isn't designed for realm hopping. But the fact is that it has to be an ability of Forbidden Spinjitzu, because Pixel is the one specifically who sends the ninja off. So, unless Pixel suddenly knows how to do magic, Pixel was obviously the one who used Forbidden Spinjitzu to send the ninja off. And that actually leads into the next ability, and the second to last one in my opinion that kind of goes unnoticed, and that's the fact that it seems to have an effect on non-elemental users. Now the thing is, we only actually have one known user of the Forbidden Scrolls of Spinjitzu that is not an elemental user. Of course, all the known users are Wu, Garmadon, Lloyd, Jay, Cole, Zane, Asphira, and the last one is Pixel. Now the thing is that when Pixel actually holds the scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu, you will note that her eyes actually do light up. The fact is that they do become a white glow, which means that the scroll does have an effect on Pixel herself. Now personally speaking, I think it makes complete sense that it of course doesn't have the full array of ability that of course the rest of the ninja get to have. I personally believe that is a good argument to suggest that Pixel simply had access to certain properties of the Forbidden Scroll. But the fact is that a non-Spinjitzu master can actually access those powers, and personally speaking, of course we know for a fact that she can access the realm travel and the realm hop ability. I also do think she's susceptible to the last ability I'm going to talk about, but obviously she doesn't get access to the power upgrade, and she also doesn't get access to the living creatures. But I do think it's interesting that Forbidden Spinjitzu can have an effect essentially on anyone who actually picks it up. I do think, of course, there is certain implications, of course, with Pixel specifically. Of course, you could make the argument that her eyes lit up because she once had part of Zane's power core, but as far as I'm aware, she doesn't actually have that anymore. So the fact is that even though she could be argued to have some sort of elemental implication, I personally believe that it shows that a non-elemental master can actually have access to part of the scroll. But that then does lead into the final one that no one really talks about, and I do think it's interesting to note this, and that is the fact that, of course, the aggression and the corruption aspect certainly has an effect, but not on everyone. The fact is that the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu makes the user completely susceptible to aggression and eventually corruption, and it seems to be caused by the fact that the upgrade of power or the new abilities that they get access to is almost like an addiction. They become almost obsessed with it, and they can't seem to let that power go, because it's so much ability in your hand, it's difficult to let that kind of power go away. But the fact is that if you don't let go of that scroll after a prolonged use, you won't be able to overcome its aggression and also the corruption that it's putting onto you, and you will turn evil, and that is the ability of the Ice Emperor coming through. Now, of course, that's not the bit that's unknown, because it's very clear that that's what that does, but the fact is that there's actually people who are immune to the aggression and the corruption aspect, and that, of course, is people who aren't in fact good. This weakness seems to come in when your soul is more pure. The fact is that when you are more pure, it seems to have a greater effect and slowly corrupt you quicker and quicker. Of course, Zane is a fairly pure soul, but it eventually got to him, and it definitely had a great effect on him. But the fact is that the known users who aren't inherently good or don't have pure souls didn't have any sort of change in their personality or in their ability themselves. And of course, a sphere is a perfect example of this, but I want to call on the other one, Garmadon. When both Wu and Garmadon were using the Forbidden Scrolls of Spinjitzu, of course, Garmadon wasn't pure of heart, he wasn't pure of soul, because he was bitten by the Great Devourer, and the fact is that he had absolutely no problem using the power, letting go of the power, and using it without any sort of effect, whereas Wu had a notable difficulty being able to do that. It shows that when someone is not pure of heart and the power can't already corrupt something that is corrupted, it seems to have no actual effect on it. They seem to be able to use that power as if they can just have it just because, which I do think is interesting to note. Because this means that the first Spinjitzu master basically made something to make people evil. The people who are good, the people who you'd want to use it, simply would eventually become evil. Whereas the people who aren't good can just use it basically free of consequence. And I find it interesting to note that the first Spinjitzu master didn't destroy something like that. Like I said earlier, of course he did hide it, but the fact is that he still left it open for someone to eventually find. And I do think it's interesting that he would allow that power to essentially be out there. And this is not me teeing up some theory about the first Spinjitzu master being evil. I simply think this is just a momentary lapse of judgment from the first Spinjitzu master himself. I think he honestly thought what he was doing was ultimately a good thing, and ultimately it wasn't. But those are the abilities of the Scroll of Forbidden Spinjitzu I feel like aren't really mentioned. Of course, it feels interesting to note, like I said, that it wasn't Asphira the whole time who banished Zane, and also the fact that a user like Garmadon can simply use the Forbidden Scrolls free of charge. But in the end, of course, one of the scrolls was destroyed by Zane once he realized what he was doing, and the other one is currently intact and its current whereabouts are actually unknown. Presumably, Wu has either hidden it away somewhere in the monastery, or he hid it away where no one can find it. Do I think we'll ever see the scrolls again, or more specifically the scroll? No. I think honestly Forbidden Spinjitzu has run its course, and I think they would rather introduce something else if they needed that kind of ability within the land of Ninjago. Although I do think it's funny to note, it's a weird callback in retrospect. Of course, the first Spinjitzu master realized that these scrolls were dangerous, so he decided to hide them away where no one could find them. And if you think about it chronologically speaking, Wu also does do that later down the line. He also hides the golden weapons away somewhere where no one can find because he deemed that they were too dangerous because Garmadon was after them. So it shows in retrospect a weird case of like father like son. When something's too dangerous, he simply hides them away. And also it is worth noting that Wu did know supposedly where the scrolls were, he just simply didn't want the ninja to have them. And also, both scrolls do change location before Wu was able to ever actually get them. But it is noted that Wu did have some sort of record on what the first Spinjitzu master did do with the scrolls. So I do think that's interesting because he technically now did that twice. But overall, I do think these scrolls of Forbidden Spinjitzu were a very fun artifact and has had a very interesting amount of implications when it comes to Ninjago. I do think unfortunately they were overshadowed by a very divisive season, but I do think the scrolls were one of the better aspects of the season itself, and honestly makes the season worth a rewatch. But let me know what you guys think. Do you enjoy the scrolls of Forbidden Spinjitzu? Do you wish they were still around? Did you enjoy how they were utilized? And do you think there's something more to them that I have not discussed today? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on them because ultimately I do think they're very interesting weapons that kind of don't really go noted. But that is about it for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know if there are any other Ninjago weapons or artifacts you would like to see me talk about, because I do think they're fascinating, and I love deep diving into these specific items from the show itself. But like I said, that is about it for today, and take care. Okay, bye!